The ink on the eviction notice was black, but in the suffocating silence of his father's oak-paneled study, 18-year-old Julian Vance thought it looked exactly like dried blood. "Sign it." The voice cut through the room, sharper than the January wind rattling the window panes. His father, Arthur Vance Sr., didn't look up from his ledger. "A signature is just a stroke of a pen, Julian. If your hand shakes over one family, this empire will crush you." Julian remembered the way his fingers had trembled. He remembered the faint smell of cigar smoke and expensive leather, mingling with the sickening realization of what he was doing. With one jagged stroke of a Mont Blanc fountain pen, he had thrown a family of 4 into the freezing streets of Brooklyn. "Pity is a luxury we cannot afford," his father had whispered, finally placing a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. "The moment you see them as human beings instead of liabilities, you've already lost. Feel nothing. Count the margins." Julian hadn't just learned the lesson. He had internalized it, swallowed it whole, and let it freeze his veins. 27 years later, the trembling boy was dead. In his place sat a ghost in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. The grandfather clock in the corner of the penthouse ticked a heavy, rhythmic pulse that only emphasized the suffocating emptiness of the room. Julian Vance, now 45, stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan sanctuary, 70 floors above the glittering, indifferent grid of New York City. Down there, the February blizzard was burying the streets in blinding white. Up here, behind soundproof, bullet-resistant glass, the storm was nothing more than a silent movie. He took a slow sip of a 1982 Bordeaux. The crystal glass felt heavy, cold against his lips. The wine tasted like ash, but then again, everything had tasted like ash for the last 2 decades. He was the CEO of Vance Horizon. $3.2 billion in assets. 18,000 rental units spread out across the East Coast. His name was etched into the skyline, celebrated in Forbes, feared in boardrooms. He dictated where thousands of families slept, what they paid, and how quickly they could be erased if they failed to comply. Yet, in 20 years of absolute dominion, Julian had never once stepped foot inside a building he owned. He had never breathed the stale air of a poorly ventilated hallway, never looked a struggling mother in the eye, never heard the quiet, desperate pleas of a father begging for just one more week. He didn't have to. He had built a fortress of algorithms to do the dirty work for him. His phone buzzed on the kitchen island, a massive slab of Calcutta marble that had never seen a home-cooked meal. The screen illuminated the dark room. Evelyn Harper. Julian didn't answer immediately. He let it buzz, watching the caller ID flash like a warning signal. Evelyn, his chief operating officer, was the perfect architect for his cold empire. She was brilliant, ruthless, and viewed the world strictly in binary, profit or loss. She was the gatekeeper of his isolation. He finally swiped the screen. "Speak. Q4 projections are in." Evelyn's voice clipped through the speaker, crisp and entirely devoid of warmth. "Occupancy in the Detroit and South Bronx portfolios is holding at 94%. The new automated eviction protocol is running flawlessly, Julian. We've managed to cut the grace period down by an additional 48 hours. Turnovers are up. Margins are bleeding green." Julian stared out at the swirling snow. A gust of wind slammed against the glass, a muffled thud that sent a micro-vibration through the soles of his Oxford shoes. "Any pushback from the housing courts?" "Nothing our legal team can't bury," Evelyn replied smoothly. There was a subtle pause, the kind of pregnant silence that held a hidden weight. "The system is working perfectly, Julian. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't feel. Just like you wanted. Keep it that way." Julian murmured. He ended the call, tossing the phone onto the marble counter. The hollow clatter echoed through the cavernous living room. The dining table behind him sat 20, a sprawling masterpiece of polished mahogany. In 5 years of living there, not a single guest had ever occupied one of those chairs. He was a king ruling over a kingdom of spreadsheets. To Julian Vance, a tenant was not a person. A tenant was a glowing pixel on a monitor. A line item. If a pixel turned red, the system simply deleted it. It wasn't malice, it was mathematics. If you can't pay, you made bad choices, and your bad choices are not my liability. He repeated this mantra like a dark prayer, letting it shield him from the lingering ghost of the boy who had once trembled holding a pen. The penthouse HVAC hummed, a low artificial breath that circulated perfectly purified air. Julian walked over to the sprawling leather sofa and sat down, his movements slow, mechanical. A plate of seared scallops sat untouched on the coffee table, growing cold. He picked up the remote and pressed the power button. The massive OLED screen flickered to life, bathing the dim room in a harsh blue light. Channel 7 News. Breaking coverage. He wasn't really watching. The television was just white noise, a digital companion to fill the deafening silence of his own success. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the exhaustion of running a multi-billion-dollar empire wash over him. But then, the newscaster's voice shifted. The tone dropped, losing its polished cadence, replaced by a raw, unscripted gravity. A devastating scene unfolding tonight, in this brutal cold. Julian's eyes fluttered open. The screen was no longer showing stock tickers or political debates. It showed a frozen sidewalk, illuminated by the harsh, flickering glare of a street lamp. And in the center of the frame, standing amidst a pile of split black garbage bags, was a little girl holding a worn-out stuffed rabbit. Julian's hand froze midair, the crystal glass hovering inches from his lips. The silence in the penthouse shattered. Chapter 2. The fateful broadcast in the dead of winter. The crystal glass remained suspended in the air. A single drop of condensation formed on the delicate rim, slid down the smooth curve of the bowl, and fell onto Julian's Tom Ford trousers. The cold dampness barely registered against his skin. On the 70-inch OLED screen, the world was unforgivingly real. "We are live in Detroit's North End," the reporter's voice crackled, struggling against the violent howl of the February wind. The microphone picked up the frantic rustling of her heavy parka. "Temperatures have plummeted to -4 degrees tonight, with wind chills making it feel closer to -20. And yet, out here, in this deadly freeze, is where 32-year-old Nia Caldwell and her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, will be spending their night." Julian slowly lowered his glass to the marble coffee table. The faint clink was instantly swallowed by the howling wind broadcasting from the television speakers. The camera panned, abandoning the reporter's face to focus on the snow-covered sidewalk. It wasn't the tragedy that hooked Julian's attention. He had seen poverty before. He quantified it, categorized it daily. It was the absolute, eerie stillness of the woman on the screen. Nia Caldwell wasn't sobbing for the cameras. She wasn't screaming at the sky or begging for mercy. She stood in front of a meager pile of belongings, 2 split black trash bags, a plastic laundry basket filled with random kitchenware, and a single, battered suitcase, like a soldier guarding a ruined fortress. She wore a faded navy blue coat that was far too thin for a Detroit winter, her bare hands tucked deep into her pockets. Her jaw was clenched tight, her dark, exhausted eyes staring straight through the camera lens. It was a look of pure, unadulterated survival. A fierce pride that refused to shatter, even as her entire world collapsed around her. And then, The cameraman shifted the lens slightly downward. Sitting on the larger of the two trash bags was a little girl. Lily. She wore a bright yellow knit hat that looked absurdly cheerful against the gray, desolate backdrop of the slums. Her small, trembling hands were tightly clutching a stuffed rabbit, its ears severely frayed, one plastic button eye missing. She was burying her face deep into the rabbit's worn fur, as if the cheap plush toy could somehow shield her from the biting frost. Nia, a certified home health aide who regularly works 14-hour shifts to care for the elderly, was evicted from her apartment just 2 hours ago, the reporter continued, the words piling up in the quiet penthouse like heavy stones. She claims she missed a single payment after her placement agency delayed her wages. Despite multiple desperate calls and emails to her property management company, no one answered. The system simply locked her out. Julian's chest tightened. An invisible, icy hand gripped his lungs. The system. The new automated eviction protocol is running flawlessly, Julian. Evelyn Harper's voice echoed in the dark recesses of his skull, a phantom whisper mingling with the television's audio. Julian's jaw clenched. He reached for the remote control resting on the leather sofa. He needed to turn it off. He needed to silence the noise, pour another glass of the 82 Bordeaux, and retreat into the comfortable numbness of his isolation. He pressed his thumb against the power button. Do it. Feel nothing. Count the margins. His father's voice crawled up his spine, as cold as the marble beneath his feet. But his thumb wouldn't press down. On the screen, the little girl looked up. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, a fleeting white ghost in the darkness. The microphone caught her fragile voice, barely a whisper over the roaring wind. Mommy, is my bunny allowed in the new house? It's too cold out here. Nia Caldwell knelt in the snow. She pulled her bare, freezing hands from her pockets and gently cupped her daughter's face. For a split second, the impenetrable wall of her pride cracked, and her voice wavered. We'll find a warm place for both of you, baby. I promise. Julian stopped breathing. The steady, mechanical inner beat of his perfectly controlled life skipped. It wasn't pity welling up inside him, it was a visceral, suffocating horror. Because he knew exactly how this brutal world worked. He knew there was no new house waiting for them. Then, the camera operator stepped back for a wider shot, framing the looming backdrop of the tragedy. A 5-story brick building, its facade heavily scarred by decades of exhaust fumes and deliberate neglect. Rusted metal fire escapes clung to the crumbling masonry like the ribs of a rotting carcass. And above the shattered glass of the main entrance, barely illuminated by a flickering dying street lamp, were the faded brass numbers, 4028. 4028 West Jefferson Avenue. For 3 seconds, the penthouse was absolutely silent, save for the low hum of the heating vent. Then, the remote slipped from Julian's paralyzed fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crack. The batteries spilled out, rolling away into the shadows under the sofa. Julian didn't blink. He couldn't. The reporter was still talking, summarizing the systemic failures of corporate landlords and gentrification, but Julian couldn't hear the words anymore. All he heard was a high-pitched ringing in his ears, like the deafening aftermath of an explosion. He knew that exact address. It was burned into his subconscious, buried deep in a quarterly projection spreadsheet he had approved just 3 weeks ago. 4028 West Jefferson. Acquired 2018. Expected quarterly yield, 8.4%. It was his building. The rusted fire escape. The shattered front door. The freezing, unforgiving sidewalk. It all belonged to him. He had spent his entire adult life building a magnificent machine designed to keep the blood off his hands, an algorithm that completely insulated him from the human cost of his boundless wealth. But as the camera zoomed in one last time on the little girl in the yellow hat, shivering in the snow because his system had deemed her a financial liability, the walls of his fortress violently crumbled. Julian Vance, the ghost in the Tom Ford suit, realized the terrifying, undeniable truth. He hadn't just watched a family get destroyed on television. He was the one holding the axe. The OLED screen automatically timed out, plunging the penthouse back into darkness, but the ghosts didn't leave. They stayed in the room, etched-eyed by the shadows. The image of the little girl in the yellow hat was burned into the back of Julian's eyelids. Julian didn't breathe. He didn't think. He moved. He lunged across the living room, his $3,000 Tom Ford shoes violently scuffing the immaculate Persian rug. He reached his mahogany desk and ripped open his MacBook Pro. The harsh, sterile white light of the screen sliced across his pale face, illuminating features that suddenly looked 10 years older. Vance Horizon Master Database. vCore. It was the crown jewel of his empire. A proprietary algorithm he had commissioned for $250 million. It was designed to completely eliminate human error, to streamline property management across 18,000 units. No managers to bribe, no tears to sway a decision. Just cold, hard code. He typed the address. His fingers, usually so steady during multi-million-dollar board meetings, kept slipping on the keys. 4028 West Jefferson Avenue. Unit 214. The file loaded instantly. The interface was beautiful, minimalist, and mercilessly efficient. Tenant: Nia Caldwell. Dependents: 1 Lily Caldwell. Age 7. Lease start: October 2021. Monthly rate: $1,150. Julian's eyes darted to the payment history section, a long horizontal timeline of data blocks. Green. 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 He scrolled back through the years. Month after month, without a single failure, the blocks were solid green. Nia Caldwell had paid her rent on the first of the month, every single month, for over 4 years. She was the textbook definition of a perfect tenant. Then, his cursor hit November of last year. A yellow warning triangle, followed by a sea of deep, fatal red. Julian leaned closer, the glow of the screen reflecting in his bloodshot eyes. The penthouse was deathly quiet. The only sound was the frantic, heavy thudding of his own heart, and the distant, muffled wail of an ambulance siren somewhere down on Fifth Avenue. He clicked on the yellow triangle to open the internal transaction log. November 1st. Payment failed. Insufficient funds. November 4th. Payment received in full, $1,150. Status: late. Automated processing fee applied, $12. Julian frowned, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. $12? He kept reading the system logs, and as the algorithm's logic unfolded before him, the air in his lungs turned to shattered glass. Nia had paid her rent just 3 days late because her agency held her paycheck over a holiday weekend. She paid the full $1,150. But because she was late, vCore automatically generated a $12 administrative late fee. When December 1st rolled around, Nia paid her standard $1,150. But the vCore algorithm was programmed to prioritize outstanding debts first. The system automatically siphoned $12 from her December rent to cover the November late fee, which meant her December rent was short by exactly $12. And according to the ruthless parameters Julian himself had approved, an incomplete rent payment triggered a compounding daily penalty of $75. Nia didn't know. The system had sent automated warnings to an old email address she no longer used, buried deep in a database. By the time January 1st arrived, that $12 deficit had mutated into $2,250 in late penalties. January 12th. Eviction filed. February 14th. Eviction executed. Julian pushed himself away from the desk. The leather chair rolled backward, hitting the bookshelf with a dull thud. $12. The price of a mediocre latte and a croissant in Manhattan. A fraction of a tip he would leave a valet. He turned his head slowly, looking at the half-empty bottle of 1,982 Bordeaux sitting on his coffee table. One sip of that wine cost more than the clerical error that had just thrown a 7-year-old girl into a blizzard. He clicked into the communication logs. Tenant incoming call. 1 attempts. Duration. Unanswered. Placed in automated holding queue. Tenant walk-in at regional office. Logged by security. Directed to use online portal. We process over 18,000 units, Julian. We can't make individual exceptions without compromising operational efficiency. Evelyn's words, spoken so proudly just an hour ago, now sounded like a confession to a massacre. The system wasn't broken. That was the most terrifying part. The system had functioned flawlessly. It had executed exactly what Julian had built it to do. It turned a desperate mother into a liability and surgically removed her from the portfolio without requiring a single human being to look her in the eye. Julian stood up. His legs felt hollow, like he was walking through deep water. He moved to the massive glass window, pressing his forehead against the cold, bulletproof pane. Below him, the city was a grid of golden lights, millions of souls trapped in their own invisible systems. For 27 years, he had worn his father's armor. Feel nothing. Count the margins. But the armor wasn't protecting him anymore. It was crushing him from the inside. He closed his eyes. The static hum of the penthouse suddenly felt unbearable. A moment of absolute stillness. The heavy, suffocating calm before the storm breaks. Then, Julian turned. He didn't call Evelyn. He didn't call his PR team to draft a damage control statement. He reached for his phone and dialed a private number. "Captain," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, razor-sharp and dangerously calm. The inner tremor was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. "Prep the Gulf Stream. We're flying to Detroit. Tonight. At 35,000 feet, the Gulfstream G650ER was a sanctuary of absolute silence and warm, handcrafted leather. But as the landing gear violently slammed onto the frozen tarmac of Detroit Metropolitan Airport at 3:14 a.m., the illusion of safety shattered. Julian Vance was stepping out of the sky, descending directly into the graveyard he had built. He ordered the driver of the black Escalade to stop 3 blocks away from the address. The driver hesitated, looking through the rearview mirror at the Billionaire in the back seat, thinking the man had lost his mind. Julian didn't explain. He simply pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the -20-degree wind chill. His $4,000 Loro Piana cashmere overcoat felt like paper against the brutal Michigan wind. The cold didn't care about his net worth. It sank straight into his bones, biting and ruthless. Julian needed this. He needed to walk through the icy sludge, to feel the agonizing physical distance between the sterile perfection of his penthouse and the pavement he owned. The neighborhood was a decaying monument to the forgotten American dream. Streetlights flickered aggressively, casting long, distorted shadows over potholes filled with black ice. A neon liquor store sign buzzed in the dead of night, the only pulse in a lifeless grid. And then, At the end of the block, it loomed in the dark. 4028 West Jefferson Avenue. It looked infinitely worse in person than on the high-definition broadcast. A decaying, 5-story monolith of soot-stained brick. The front security door, a line item in the budget that Julian's company charged tenants a monthly safety premium for, was propped wide open by a crumbling cinder block. The lock had been violently ripped out so long ago that the jagged metal edges were thick with rust. Julian stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The sensory assault was immediate. The air was incredibly thick, heavily layered with the suffocating stench of black mold, decades of fried onions, and the metallic tang of raw sewage from a backed-up pipe. Above him, a single fluorescent bulb flickered, buzzing frantically like a dying insect trapped in a jar. The elevator doors were rusted shut, bearing a yellowed out-of-order sign that curled at the edges. Julian took the stairs. The iron railing wobbled precariously under his grip, completely detached from the wall in several places. On the second-floor landing, a large rat scurried casually across the peeling linoleum, not even bothering to run. It wasn't afraid of him. Nothing in this building was afraid of its owner, because nobody here knew his face. Julian walked down the narrow, freezing corridor and stopped in front of Unit 214, Nia Caldwell's former door. The wood around the deadbolt was violently splintered, bearing the fresh, jagged scars of a forced eviction. Julian stood there in the heavy silence. He placed his bare, trembling hand against the scarred wood. $12, his mind whispered. A $12 system error did this. He turned and knocked on the adjacent door. Unit 216. A heavy, suspicious silence followed, then the harsh scrape of a deadbolt. The door cracked open exactly 2 inches, stopped abruptly by a heavy brass chain. A pair of cautious, exhausted eyes peered out from the dark gap. It was an elderly woman, wrapped in 3 layers of frayed cardigans. "What do you want?" Her voice was a rasp of sandpaper. It wasn't hostile, just deeply weathered by a lifetime of expecting the worst from strangers wearing nice coats. "My name is Julian," he said softly. He swallowed his last name. It tasted like ash in his throat. "I work with the ownership group. I'm inspecting the conditions." The woman let out a bitter, humorless laugh that quickly dissolved into a wet, rattling cough. "Ownership? Ain't seen a living soul from ownership in 4 years." She unchained the door and swung it open. "Come on in then. Look at your conditions." Her name was Mrs. Gable. Her small living room was illuminated only by the harsh, glowing orange coils of a cheap space heater in the corner. The walls were literally weeping dark brown water stains spread across the cracked ceiling like bruised flesh. She wore fingerless wool gloves inside her own home. "Boiler's been dead since Martin Luther King Day, Mrs. Gable muttered, pulling her cardigans tighter around her frail chest. "I called Vanguard Management 8 times. You know what they sent me? A printed notice threatening a $50 fine for using an unauthorized space heater. Said it's a fire hazard." Julian stood frozen, staring at the freezing water dripping slowly from the ceiling into a plastic bucket near the window. Drip, drip, drip. Every drop felt like a hammer striking his skull. "Did you know the woman next door?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the heavy tension in the room. "Nia Caldwell? Mrs. Gable's hardened eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but her jaw quickly clenched in deep, simmering resentment. "Nia? That girl worked herself to the bone. Night shifts, double shifts. Her little girl, Lily. Always so polite, always holding that raggedy bunny. Nia used to knock on my door at 6 in the morning after a 14-hour shift at the hospital just to make sure I hadn't frozen to death in the night. Mrs. Gable stepped closer to Julian, her frail frame trembling with a sudden, quiet rage. She looked him dead in the eye, seeing right through his expensive suit. She paid her rent. She kept her head down. And your people threw her and that baby out into a blizzard like they were trash. This building might be rotting, mister, but the people who run it are the real garbage. Julian didn't defend himself. He couldn't. The words cut through him with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, hitting the exact nerve he had spent 27 years trying to numb. He left her apartment and stepped back out into the suffocating hallway. Leaning his back against the freezing, peeling plaster, he closed his eyes. The building breathed around him, the clanking of frozen pipes, the muffled, sickly coughs echoing through paper-thin walls, the undeniable, crushing weight of human suffering. 18,000 units. $3.2 billion. And this was what his empire actually looked like from the inside. It wasn't a business. It was a slaughterhouse that extracted blood and turned it into quarterly dividends. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen glared in the dark corridor. It was 5 a.m. In 3 hours, the regional office of Vanguard Asset Management would open its doors. And Julian Vance was going to walk through them, ready to burn it all down. The receptionist at Vanguard Asset Management didn't even have time to deploy her practiced corporate smile. The heavy, frosted glass doors didn't just open. They were violently shoved apart, shattering the sterile, pine-scented calm of the 8 a.m. office routine. Julian Vance stepped onto the pristine white Italian porcelain. His $4,000 cashmere coat was soaked at the hem with dirty snow and reeked heavily of black mold, stale grease, and raw sewage. He looked less like a Wall Street billionaire and more like an executioner who had just crawled out of a mass grave. The regional director, a balding man in a cheap polyester suit named Greg Thorne, nearly dropped his organic espresso. He scrambled out of his glass-walled office, his face draining of all color. Mr. Vance? We weren't expecting. Walk me through it. Julian's voice was a dead, flat whisper. It wasn't a shout. It was the terrifying, suffocating quiet that precedes a devastating earthquake. Sir? Greg stammered, wiping sweaty palms on his slacks. The morning sun sliced through the Venetian blinds, casting sharp, cage-like shadows across the spotless office floor. The gentle, expensive hum of the central HVAC system blew warm air over Julian's frozen shoulders, a sickening contrast to Mrs. Gable's freezing, weeping walls just 3 miles away. The $12 automated penalty, Julian said, his eyes locking onto Greg with the predatory intensity of a starving wolf. The eviction of Nia Caldwell and her 7-year-old daughter. Walk me through exactly how your office destroyed a family's life over the price of a mediocre sandwich. Greg swallowed hard. He backed up a step, terrified, completely misunderstanding the nature of Julian's wrath. Mr. Vance, I assure you, it was completely by the book. The V-Core system flagged the delinquency. We sent the automated emails. When the balance wasn't cleared by the 14th, the system initiated the lockout. We were just following the optimization protocols. Your protocols, sir. It's exactly what Vance Horizon pays us to do. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the lobby. The espresso machine hissed in the background, a sharp, venomous sound. Julian stopped, the anger draining from his face, replaced by a cold, hollow horror. Greg wasn't the monster. Greg was just a cog. Julian had built the machine. He had signed the contracts. He had incentivized this exact, ruthless efficiency. Before Julian could speak, a sharp, rhythmic vibration buzzed in his coat pocket. He slowly pulled out his phone. Evelyn Harper. Julian swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. He didn't say a word. Julian. Evelyn's voice flowed through the earpiece. It was flawlessly smooth, a perfect sheet of black ice. I see Vanguard's Detroit office just logged an unscheduled visit from the CEO. The board is already whispering, Julian. You are standing in a third-party vendor's lobby covered in mud, acting on an emotional impulse. It's erratic. They evicted a mother and a little girl over $12, Evelyn. 12. Julian's voice was dangerously low. Beneath the icy delivery, a deep, bleeding wound was tearing open. And? That single word hung in the air. And? A $12 margin error multiplied by 18,000 units is over $200,000 in leaked revenue, Evelyn continued, her tone completely devoid of malice. It was purely transactional. We don't run a charity, Julian. We run a machine. You built it to protect the portfolio. Are you really going to break your own life's work over one defective tenant? Julian closed his eyes. The smell of his own coat, the stench of the slums, filled his lungs. He saw his father standing in the study. Sign it, Julian. Pity is a luxury. For 27 years, Evelyn had been the perfect mirror reflecting his father's philosophy. A moment of absolute stillness. Julian stood completely frozen in the blindingly bright office. He lowered his gaze to a perfectly manicured potted fern in the corner, a detail so trivial it made him sick. The portfolio is bleeding, Evelyn, Julian finally whispered. It just doesn't show up on your spreadsheets. Julian, I am warning you. Do not let sentiment compromise this company. The shareholders will not. Julian ended the call. The click echoed in his mind like a vault slamming shut. He slowly slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked up at Greg Thorne. Greg was trembling now, sensing the massive, invisible shift in the room's atmosphere. Where do they go, Greg? Julian asked, his voice entirely devoid of its former aggression. It was broken, exhausted, yet impossibly heavy. What? Who, sir? The displaced. The ones your system spits out into the snow. Where do they go? Greg wiped his brow. Usually. The Grace Memorial Church shelter on 8th Street. But sir, about the Vanguard contract. There is no Vanguard contract, Julian said softly. He turned his back on the regional director, his wet shoes squeaking slightly on the pristine porcelain. As of 8:15 this morning, Vance Horizon is terminating the partnership. Pack up your desks. Julian pushed the heavy glass doors open, stepping back out into the freezing, unforgiving wind of the Detroit morning. He didn't look back. The ghost of his father was finally dead. Now, he had to find a little girl in a yellow hat. The heavy oak doors of Grace Memorial Church did not open with a welcoming creak. They groaned, like the splintering hull of a sinking ship. Julian Vance stepped out of the freezing Detroit blizzard and into the basement shelter. The sensory shift was violent. The air inside was suffocatingly thick, heavily laced with the smell of boiled celery, cheap bouillon, and the sharp chemical sting of industrial bleach. Above him, a row of ancient fluorescent tubes flickered violently, casting a jaundiced, sickly yellow light over 50 military surplus cots crammed shoulder to shoulder. In the corner, a 1970s cast-iron radiator wheezed rhythmically, a desperate, asthmatic sound that served as the heartbeat of this forgotten purgatory. Julian stood, perfectly still, at the entrance. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the muffled, hollow coughs of the displaced and the rustle of thin foil emergency blankets. Slowly, deliberately, He unbuttoned his $4,000 Loro Piana cashmere coat. He let it slip from his shoulders, draping it over a folding chair near the entrance. It felt grotesque to wear it in a room where people were shivering in their own skin. "You lost, friend. Or are you just hiding from the wind?" The voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, cutting through the heavy air. Julian turned. Standing behind a long plastic folding table was a tall, deeply weathered black man in his early 60s. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a canvas apron, rhythmically stirring a massive, dented aluminum pot with a wooden spoon. This was Marcus, a former high school history teacher who now spent his retirement feeding the casualties of the American dream. Marcus's dark, intelligent eyes scanned Julian. He took in the tailored Tom Ford suit, the bespoke Oxford shoes now stained with dirty slush, and the pale, haunted hollows beneath Julian's eyes. Marcus didn't judge the wealth. He simply recognized the unmistakable, paralyzing weight of a man whose soul was actively tearing itself apart. Julian walked slowly toward the folding table. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice entirely stripped of its boardroom command. It was raw, hesitant. Marcus stopped stirring. A heavy beat of silence stretched between them, filled only by the bubbling of the soup. Without a word, Marcus picked up a styrofoam cup, ladled a portion of the thin, watery broth into it, and slid it across the plastic table. "Take it," Marcus said softly, his tone completely unreadable. "Your hands are shaking." Julian looked down at his own hands. They were trembling violently, a physiological rebellion he couldn't control. He wrapped his frozen fingers around the cheap styrofoam. The sudden, intense heat seeped into his skin, a stark, painful contrast to the ice in his veins. "A woman," Julian finally whispered, his throat tight. "Nia Caldwell. And a little girl. Lily." She was wearing a yellow hat. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his heavy, calloused hands on the rim of the aluminum pot. The inner beat of the moment shifted. The old man's eyes hardened. A subtle, but dangerous flare of protective instinct. "Yeah, they're here," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp murmur. He didn't point. He just stared unblinkingly at Julian. "But let me tell you something about that woman before you go marching over there to unload whatever corporate guilt trip brought you down to this basement." Julian didn't flinch. He gripped the cup tighter. The styrofoam squeaked under the pressure. "Nia worked a 14-hour shift yesterday," Marcus continued, the quiet fury in his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "She wiped the spit and blood off dying folks who don't even remember her name. She does everything this country tells you to do to survive. She works hard. She pays her dues. And she still lost her roof." Marcus leaned closer, the smell of old sage and simmering broth rising between them. "The system didn't make a mistake, mister. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It chewed up a poor, hard-working mother, and it spit out the bones." The words struck Julian with the blunt force of a physical blow. It was a mirror held up to his own monstrous reflection. He was the system. He was the architect of the slaughterhouse. Julian looked down at the cup. A single drop of condensation rolled down the side of the white styrofoam, hitting the plastic table with a tiny, imperceptible tap. The stillness before the motion. "I know," Julian whispered. The two words carried the crushing gravity of a full confession. Marcus studied Julian's face for a long, quiet moment. The old teacher had seen plenty of wealthy men drop off checks to buy their way into heaven, but he had never seen a billionaire look this utterly, hopelessly destroyed. Marcus slowly picked up his wooden spoon and tapped it against the side of the pot. "Back left corner," Marcus said softly, going back to his stirring. Tread lightly, friend. Pride is the only thing she's got left, and it's a dangerous thing to corner. Julian turned. Under the flickering, amber glow of a dying light bulb at the far end of the basement, he saw them. Nia Caldwell was sitting on the edge of a narrow green military cot. She wasn't sleeping. She was hunched over a cracked clipboard, furiously handwriting job applications in the dim light. Beside her, curled into a remarkably tiny ball, was Lily. The little girl still wore the bright yellow knit hat pulled down over her ears, her small arms wrapped fiercely around the battered, one-eyed stuffed rabbit. Julian stood perfectly still in the shadows, listening to the wheezing radiator and the frantic scratching of Nia's pen. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that all the money in his bank accounts couldn't simply fix this. To truly save them, he was going to have to bleed. The scratching of the pen stopped. It didn't taper off. It ceased with a sharp, violent halt, the metal nib biting deep into the cheap paper. Nia Caldwell didn't look up immediately. She sat perfectly still on the edge of the military cot, her spine rigid under the thin fabric of her faded hospital scrubs. The flickering amber bulb above them swung slightly from a draft, casting long, swaying shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Julian stood 10 feet away. The $4,000 cashmere coat was gone, left at the door, but his bespoke Tom Ford suit still screamed of a world that didn't belong in this purgatory. The air between them was incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating smell of industrial bleach, damp wool, and the metallic tang of old radiator pipes. "I don't have any change," Nia said. Her voice was flat, entirely devoid of anger or sorrow. It was the terrifying, hollow calm of a woman who had already fought a war and had nothing left to bleed. Julian took a slow step forward. The rubber sole of his Oxford shoe squeaked against the damp linoleum. "I'm not here for change, Miss Caldwell." Nia finally raised her head. Her dark eyes, exhausted and deeply sunken, locked onto his. She scanned him, the expensive, immaculate fabric, the perfectly manicured hands, the hollow, haunted look in his pale eyes. She read him with the brutal accuracy of someone who spent 14 hours a day watching heart monitors flatline. "You're him," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. The name on the lease agreements. Vance. Julian swallowed hard. The sound was deafening in his own ears. Yes. Nia didn't scream. She didn't lunge at him. She just carefully set her clipboard down on the green canvas of the cot, her movements painfully deliberate. "Did you come down here to watch us freeze in person? Was the television screen not entertaining enough for your evening?" "I came to fix it," Julian said, his voice cracking. He reached into his inner breast pocket, his trembling fingers brushing against a heavy platinum card that had a limit higher than the GDP of a small island nation. "I can get you a hotel. Right now. A permanent residence by tomorrow morning. I can." "Stop." The word cracked through the damp air like a whip. Nia stood up. She was a foot shorter than Julian, but in that flickering, claustrophobic basement, she towered over him. "Put your wallet away, Mr. Vance. I don't want your guilt money." "It's not guilt," Julian lied, his chest tightening. "It's a correction. It's a payout." Nia shot back, her voice dropping to a lethal, razor-sharp whisper so she wouldn't wake the children sleeping on nearby cots. The scent of cheap antiseptic soap clung to her skin. "I've seen men like you my whole life. You build machines that crush our bones, and when you finally hear the crunch, you show up with a check to buy back your own soul. You don't care about me. You care about being able to sleep tonight." Julian stepped back, as if physically struck. The truth in her words was absolute, stripping away his final layer of defense. He had wanted to play the savior. He had wanted a clean financial transaction to erase the $12 error. "I worked for 5 years," Nia said, stepping closer, her eyes blazing with an unfathomable fire. "I paid my rent. I kept my head down. And your system threw my baby onto the freezing concrete like a bag of trash over $12. You can't buy back what you broke. You can't write a check for the way she looked at me when the deadbolt locked us out." A heavy, agonizing silence fell over them. The cast iron radiator hissed in the corner, a slow release of pressure. Then, a small rustle of fabric. On the cot, Lily shifted. The little girl rubbed her eyes with a small, trembling fist. She sat up slowly, clutching the one-eyed stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. The bright yellow knit hat slipped slightly over her forehead. She looked at her exhausted mother, then turned her large, innocent eyes to the towering stranger in the expensive suit. The inner beat of the room completely stopped. The agonizing stillness before the execution. "Mommy?" Lily's voice was tiny, fragile, echoing in the cavernous basement. "Is that the man who took our door?" Julian stopped breathing. The invisible bullet tore straight through his chest, obliterating whatever was left of the ruthless CEO his father had built. He couldn't look away from the 7-year-old girl. Julian choked on the word. He dropped to one knee. The pristine fabric of his trousers soaked up the dirty, freezing puddle on the concrete floor, but he didn't care. He looked directly into Lily's eyes, stripping away 27 years of corporate armor. "Yes?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, raw honesty. "I'm the man who took your door. And I am so sorry." Lily stared at him in the dim light, holding her bunny tighter against her chin. "My bunny is cold," she said simply. Julian closed his eyes. A single hot tear finally broke loose, cutting a slow path down his pale cheek. He didn't reach for his wallet again. He didn't offer a penthouse suite or a luxury hotel. Nia was right. A payout was an insult. A true correction required tearing the whole system down to its bloody roots. Julian stood up slowly. He looked at Nia, his expression completely transformed. The haunted, broken billionaire was gone. In his place was a man preparing for an absolute, scorched earth war. "Keep your pride, Miss Caldwell," Julian said, his voice steady, carrying a dark, lethal resolve. "I'm not going to buy you a new house. I'm going to give you back yours. Even if I have to burn my own company to the ground to do it." He turned and walked away, his wet shoes echoing on the concrete as he disappeared into the heavy shadows of the basement. The doors to the Vance Horizon executive boardroom were forged from imported, frosted glass, thick enough to muffle a gunshot. When they slid open on their silent tracks, at exactly 2 p.m., the quiet murmur of 12 billionaires instantly evaporated. Julian Vance walked into the room. He hadn't slept. He hadn't showered. He hadn't even changed his clothes. Against the hyper-sterile, flawlessly polished mahogany and the blinding panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, Julian looked like an apparition. His bespoke Tom Ford trousers were permanently stained with the freezing, filthy slush of Detroit. His $4,000 cashmere coat still reeked heavily of black mold, damp wool, and the unmistakable, suffocating scent of poverty. The temperature in the room was a perfectly regulated 72 degrees, a gentle flow of purified air humming softly from the ceiling vents. But as Julian walked the length of the 50-foot table, he brought the freezing chill of the Michigan slums with him. Sitting at the head of the table, Evelyn Harper froze. Her Mont Blanc pen hovered exactly 1 inch above a stack of printed V-Core analytics. To her left sat Richard Sterling, a majority shareholder whose eyes were as flat and dead as a great white shark's. "Julian," Evelyn broke the heavy silence, her voice a flawless sheet of ice, carefully masking her horror at his appearance. "We were just discussing your highly erratic detour. The market is already reacting to the Vanguard termination. It was a reckless impulse." Julian didn't sit down. He stood at the opposite end of the table, resting his dirt-stained hands on the pristine mahogany. He looked at Evelyn, then at Richard. He didn't see titans of industry anymore. He saw the gears of a machine that ground up women like Nia Caldwell and spit out the bones. "Effective immediately," Julian said. His voice wasn't raised. It was a terrifying, hollow rasp, vibrating with a dark, lethal authority. "The V-Core automated protocol is suspended. Every single eviction filing across all 18,000 units is frozen. Nothing moves." The inner beat of the room flatlined. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the faint tink of an ice cube shifting in Richard Sterling's crystal water glass. Then, the boardroom erupted. "Have you lost your goddamn mind?" Richard slammed his hand flat on the table, the veneer of corporate civility instantly vanishing. "You can't unilaterally freeze operations. Do you have any idea how much capital is tied up in delinquent assets? You are bleeding the margins over a bout of bleeding heart sentimentality." Sentimentality? Julian's pale eyes locked onto Richard. He didn't yell. The terrifying stillness in his posture made the older man instinctively lean back. "A $12 system penalty, Richard. A 7-year-old girl named Lily was thrown onto the freezing concrete, clutching a broken stuffed rabbit, because our system decided a $12 clerical error was grounds for a death sentence." "It's not a death sentence, Julian. It's business," Evelyn interjected, her tone razor-sharp, trying to regain control of the room. She tapped her pen against the analytics report. Click, click, click. The sound was mechanical, merciless. "We have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders, not to the tenants. You taught me that. You built this algorithm to eliminate human error, to protect the portfolio. You cannot suddenly change the rules because you decided to eat a bowl of soup at a homeless shelter." Julian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The smell of Marcus's cheap bouillon and industrial bleach momentarily overpowered the sterile boardroom air. He could still hear the frantic scratching of Nia's pen in the dark. He could still feel the weight of Lily's gaze. "Is that the man who took our door?" "You're right, Evelyn," Julian whispered, opening his eyes. They were cold, completely devoid of fear. "I built the machine. I wrote the rules. And now, I am breaking them." Richard Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, a universally recognized declaration of war in the corporate world. "If you push this order through, Julian, we will call an emergency vote of no confidence by 5 p.m. today. We will strip you of your CEO title, lock you out of the building, and reinstate the V-Core protocols before the stock market even opens tomorrow. You might own the name on the door, but you answer to the board." The silence that followed was agonizingly heavy. The tension stretched, pulled so tight it felt like the glass windows might shatter. The board members watched Julian, waiting for the billionaire to back down, to protect his throne, to do what he had always done, count the margins. Julian slowly reached into his ruined coat. He pulled out his Platinum Access card, the physical key to the entire Vance Horizon empire, and tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp, final clack. "Call the vote, Richard," Julian said, his voice dropping to a demonic, unshakable calm. "Call the lawyers. Call the press. Do whatever you think you need to do to take my chair. But let me make one thing absolutely clear." Julian leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the table, swallowing Evelyn and Richard in darkness. "I didn't just build this company. I built the V-Core architecture. I hold the proprietary patents. If you try to push me out, I will take the software with me, and I will personally dismantle this portfolio brick by brick. I will tie this board up in so much litigation you won't be able to evict a cockroach for the next decade. Evelyn's breath hitched. She stared at Julian, realizing with absolute, horrifying certainty that he wasn't bluffing. The man standing before them wasn't trying to save his wealth. He had weaponized it. He was entirely willing to burn his own empire to the ground to illuminate the darkness he had created. "You're destroying your own legacy, Julian," Evelyn whispered, the icy composure finally cracking. "My legacy," Julian replied softly, turning his back on the board of directors, "is a little girl asking if her stuffed bunny is allowed inside to get warm." He walked toward the heavy glass doors. He didn't look back. "The freeze is in effect." Julian threw the words over his shoulder as the doors slid open. "If a single family is locked out tomorrow, I will ruin every person sitting at this table." The doors hissed shut, sealing the 12 billionaires in their sterile, perfect tomb, while the ghost of Arthur Vance finally burned away in the ashes of his son's rebellion. The sharp, metallic clack of the heavy brass deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the hallway. For someone who had never lost a home, a lock was just a piece of hardware. But for a mother who had been dragged out into a blizzard, it was the sound of a heartbeat returning to a corpse. 72 hours had passed since the boardroom massacre in Manhattan. Julian Vance hadn't waited for the legal dust to settle. While Richard Sterling and Evelyn Harper scrambled to assemble their corporate lawyers, Julian had deployed a private, high-end construction firm to 4028 West Jefferson Avenue. 3 days of relentless, agonizing labor. They ripped out the black mold. They replaced the rotting pipes. They installed state-of-the-art heating. It was late Thursday afternoon. The pale, dying winter sun bled through the newly fortified, double-paned windows of Unit 214, catching millions of dust motes dancing in the amber light. The air inside no longer smelled of raw sewage and despair. It carried the crisp, sterile scent of fresh latex paint, lemon polish, and the faint, deep warmth of the brand-new cast-iron radiator humming steadily in the corner. Nia Caldwell stood perfectly still in the center of the living room. She wore the same faded scrubs she had worn at the shelter, her posture rigid, her dark eyes scanning the room with the hyper-vigilance of a soldier walking into a potential ambush. She didn't look at the new plush sofa, nor the modest but solid oak dining table. She stared at the single sheet of paper resting on the granite kitchen counter. Lease agreement. Unit 214. Rent, $0 for the first 6 months. Capped at 25% of verifiable income thereafter. Late fees, abolished. Property management. Direct ownership, oversight. No V-Core. Julian stood near the doorway, keeping his distance. He wasn't wearing Tom Ford today. He wore a simple dark wool sweater, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes bruised and heavy, but for the first time in 27 years, his hands weren't trembling. "I'm not doing this for you," Nia finally spoke, her voice shattering the heavy silence. She didn't turn around. Her tone was a flat, cold blade. "I'm doing this because Lily wakes up screaming that her fingers are freezing. I'm doing this because she started hiding saltine crackers in her coat pockets. Don't mistake my signature for forgiveness, Mr. Vance. If you forgave me this easily, Nia, I would know you were lying," Julian replied, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. There was no defense in his posture, no billionaire's arrogance. Just a hollow, bleeding acceptance of his own sins. "This isn't charity. This is restitution. I broke your life over $12. This is simply the cost of the repair. A heavy, agonizing stillness fell over the room. The radiator clicked quietly. The distant, muffled siren of a Detroit police cruiser faded into the winter wind outside. Then, small, hesitant footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lily walked into the apartment. She was no longer bundled in 3 layers of sweaters, though she still wore the bright yellow knit hat. Her tiny hands gripped the one-eyed stuffed bunny so tightly her knuckles were white. She moved slowly, her wide, traumatized eyes taking in the pristine white walls, the warm air, the solid floors. She walked past Julian, giving him a wide, cautious berth, and stopped at the threshold of the smaller bedroom. Inside, the afternoon sun illuminated a small twin bed with a thick, lavender comforter. A modest wooden desk sat by the window. An empty bookshelf waited against the wall. Lily didn't run to the bed. She didn't jump or cheer. Trauma doesn't evaporate just because the environment changes. It lingers in the muscle memory, waiting for the floor to drop out again. She reached out with one trembling finger and touched the doorframe, as if expecting it to turn to smoke. She slowly turned to her mother. The inner beat of the room completely stopped. "Mommy." Lily's voice was barely a breath, fragile and painfully uncertain. "Is this our home for real? Or are we just hiding?" The question hung in the warm air, more devastating than any corporate threat Julian had ever faced. A 7-year-old child had completely lost the psychological concept of a home. She had learned that safety was an illusion, a temporary state that could be violently revoked by men in expensive suits. Nia's rigid spine finally broke. The fierce, impenetrable armor she had worn for months violently shattered. She dropped to her knees right there on the hardwood floor, pulling Lily into her chest. She buried her face into her daughter's small shoulder, and for the first time since the eviction, Nia Caldwell cried. It wasn't a gentle weeping, it was a guttural, earth-shattering sob that held the weight of 1,000 terrifying, sleepless nights. "It's ours, baby," Nia choked out, her hands fiercely gripping the back of Lily's sweater. "We're staying. We're safe. We're safe." Lily rested her chin on her mother's shoulder, her small hand reaching up to pat Nia's back in a heartbreaking reversal of roles. The one-eyed bunny was finally allowed to rest on the floor. Julian didn't step forward. He didn't offer a tissue. He knew he had no right to intrude on this sacred, bleeding moment. He simply stood in the shadows by the door, watching the family he had nearly destroyed find their footing in the wreckage. He quietly reached out, grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it shut behind him. He stepped out into the hallway, leaving them alone. As the lock clicked solidly into place, separating Julian from the warmth inside, the suffocating ghost of his father that had haunted his chest for nearly 3 decades finally vanished into the Detroit winter. Julian Vance was standing in a freezing, dimly lit corridor, stripped of his boardroom throne, facing a brutal corporate war. And yet, for the first time in his life, he could breathe. The manual deletion of the V-Core algorithm took exactly 4 seconds. Julian Vance stood in the subterranean server room of his Manhattan headquarters. The blinding, icy blue lights of the massive mainframe blinked frantically a dying digital heartbeat before going entirely black. The deafening, mechanical roar of the industrial cooling fans spun down, dying out until the room was swallowed by a heavy, absolute silence. Evelyn Harper had promised a bloodbath, and she had delivered. The board sued. Wall Street panicked, sending the stock plummeting into a freefall. The financial press branded Julian a catastrophic liability, a billionaire who had completely lost his nerve. So, Julian did the only thing a man with a newly awakened, bleeding conscience could do. He bled himself dry. He liquidated $1.2 billion of his personal assets. He bought out Richard Sterling, severed Evelyn Harper with a brutal severance package, and bought every hostile share to take Vance Horizon entirely private. He didn't just step off the corporate throne, he poured gasoline on the castle and burned it to the ground. 18 months later, the brutal, suffocating Michigan winter was a distant memory. A warm, golden July afternoon poured over the north end of Detroit. The heavy, nostalgic scent of summer rain hitting hot asphalt drifted through the open windows of 4028 West Jefferson Avenue. The building was unrecognizable. The crumbling cinder block propping open the front entrance was gone, replaced by a reinforced steel door with an electronic keypad. The rusted, skeletal fire escapes were now freshly painted, structurally sound iron. The hallway didn't smell of raw sewage and despair. It smelled of pine cleaner, fresh paint, and circulating air. Inside Unit 214, the cast-iron radiator sat silent. Nia Caldwell was sitting at the sturdy oak dining table, entirely submerged in a sea of pharmacology flashcards. She wasn't just a home health aide anymore. She was 3 weeks away from earning her registered nurse certification, her tuition entirely funded by the newly established Vance Tenant Defense Foundation. Across the table, Lily was aggressively coloring. Her small legs dangled off the chair, swinging freely in the warm air. She wasn't wearing a yellow knit hat, and the one-eyed bunny was safely asleep on her lavender bed. She was drawing a house. But this time, it wasn't a defensive fortress. It had wide windows, a bright red door, and a massive, blinding yellow sun stretching across the entire top of the page. A soft knock echoed at the door. Not the frantic, terrifying pounding of a process server, but a polite, patient tap. Nia opened it. Julian stood in the hallway. He looked older. The silver at his temples was far more pronounced, and his suit was less bespoke Tom Ford and more off-the-rack charcoal. The haunted, hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded clarity. "I brought the Marine Biology Encyclopedia she asked for," Julian said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, handing over a heavy, glossy hardcover. Nia took the book. Her dark eyes studied his face. The burning, lethal resentment from the church basement was completely gone. In its place was a sturdy, unspoken mutual respect. The kind of respect forged only between survivors of a war. "The coffee is hot, Julian," Nia said softly, stepping aside. "You look like you need a cup." "Maybe just for a minute," he murmured. He stepped inside. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked shut behind him. The lock wasn't a cage anymore. It was a shield. And for the first time in 28 years, sitting at a modest dining table in a Detroit apartment, Julian Vance felt entirely at peace. The inner beat of the story fades. The cinematic illusion dissolves, leaving only the cold, unforgiving reality of the American landscape. I wish I could tell you Julian Vance was a real man. I wish I could tell you there is a rogue billionaire out there tearing down his own empire to save the Nia Caldwells of the world. But there isn't. I made them up. The agonizing truth is that this story is a ghost, reflecting a very real, very American nightmare. Every single year, 3.6 million eviction cases are filed in the United States. 3.6 million. That is not a statistic. That is a population. That is more people than the entire city of Chicago. Behind every single filing is a family. A mother frantically packing black trash bags at dawn. A child asking if they are going camping because the truth of homelessness is too massive for a 5-year-old brain to process. A father choosing between insulin and keeping the heat on. 1 in 4 American renters spends more than half of their income on housing. That means a single delayed paycheck, a blown car transmission, or a minor medical emergency is the entirety of the gap between a locked door and a freezing sidewalk. It is a 60-day spiral into the abyss. You lose your address, your kids lose their school enrollment, you lose your child care, you lose your job. It's a flawless, devastating chain reaction. The impact is surgical and deeply prejudiced. Black women are evicted at twice the rate of white women. Children who experience the trauma of eviction are 4 times more likely to be hospitalized. That trauma doesn't evaporate. It lives in the nervous system. It's the way a child violently flinches when someone knocks on the door. But the data also proves that this cruelty is a choice. Right to counsel programs where tenants facing eviction are simply provided a free lawyer drop eviction rates by up to 70%. Emergency rental assistance programs prevent homelessness at a mere fraction of the cost of running shelter beds. Mediation forces landlords and tenants to sit across a table and recognize each other's humanity before reaching a courtroom. The system isn't broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It prioritizes speed, margins, and turnover over human lives. It simply needs to be redesigned by people who refuse to look away. Discomfort is where change begins. If this story left a heavy, suffocating weight in your chest, do not shake it off. Hold on to it. If you or someone you know is currently facing the crushing, terrifying machinery of eviction, call 211. It is a national hotline connecting you to local housing resources, emergency assistance, and legal aid. You do not have to fight the system in the dark. The door doesn't have to stay closed. The story of Julian and Nia is a poignant portrait of 2 Black individuals at opposite extremes of the American dream. A billionaire who froze his own soul to reach the pinnacle of power, and a fiercely resilient single mother who held on to the warmth of her humanity even when cast out into a freezing blizzard. The profound lesson here is not about burning down a billion-dollar empire, but about an awakening. Wealth can build impenetrable fortresses, but only empathy can redeem a soul. We cannot let unfeeling systems turn us into cold-blooded machines, and we must not wait until everything shatters to realize the life-saving value of compassion for one another. What are you feeling right now after walking through that emotional storm? Please take a few seconds to leave a comment and share your deepest thoughts down below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so we can continue to bring you more haunting, eye-opening stories that touch the very depths of human emotion.